So, intimacy na ito, mamaya na yung power, ano? Kanina yung power, ngayon intimacy. So, as much as possible, we would appreciate if you can fill in the front seat so that it would look good in our social media. O ano pa mga senyores? Inutan na ka mo. Tapos paarog siguro kita. A special lecture series organized by the Archdiocese of Caceres and the Ateneo de Naga University Press in cooperation with the National Book Development Board. For the fourth lecture, we are very happy to have with us a dear friend of many Bicol non-priests and scholars and students. Madi Yakal, I met him many years ago when you were still doing your, no, not your undergrad, your grad, master's. And since then, I have come to meet other people related to him, in particular, to her, in particular, Dr. Stephen Acabado, who has become both our mentor. And today, we are very happy to have with us Dr. Madi Yakal of the University of California, Los Angeles, to talk with us this very important topic on the religious iconography of the version of Peña Francia. So friends, ladies and gentlemen, people in the social media, I'd like you to welcome Dr. Madi Yakal.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. I'll be over here. Thank you for having me. This is, I think, the second time that I've been at Ateneo de Naga. My first time was in 2017 when I was just finished my master's thesis. And I'm happy to come here to share my doctoral dissertation. Unfortunately, I don't have a book yet, but if you scan this QR code, I have a free copy of my dissertation that you're welcome to enjoy, to pursue, or to peruse either today or at a later date. It's free. I'm not signing books, but I'll sign backpacks, forearms, notepads. But yeah, I'm happy to share that with you. I'd also want to say thank you to the organizers of this lecture series. I feel like there might be a little bit of pressure to kind of wrap up the talks, but I'm actually glad that we had discussions on history already, and also objects or material culture as something we can learn from, because those are both things that I look at as an anthropologist and an archaeologist. And so today I'll talk a bit about what that even means to be an anthropological archaeologist, and how that, as well as history, objects, material culture, all play into Our Lady of Peña Francia and the devotion, because that is the heart of what this lecture series has been about, and what this month is about here in Bicol, and so that will be what I talk about. So my research looks at Marian devotion as a Catholic practice, and that is the transformation of traditionally Spanish icons into recognizably Philippine icons. And so basically, my research looks at how did Bicolanos take something that is inherently Spanish. So Catholicism came when the Spanish colonized the Philippines in the 1500s and onwards. How did it go from being something inherently Spanish to something not just Filipino, but specifically Bicolano? How did that become a part of Bicolano identity, both in the past as well as today in the present? And how can we use archaeology to explore that concept of identity? And so through my research, I argue that this transformation of Our Lady of Peña Francia into a very Bicolano icon or image is indicative of Bicolano's persistence of identity, adaptability to the disruption of Spanish colonialism, and Bicolano's ability to take something maybe not so great and turn it into something better. So backtracking, how do I use anthropology and archaeology to approach this devotion and to ask my research questions? So anthropology, as I'm trained, so I'm based in University of California, Los Angeles. It's a four-field approach, which means that we use anthropology to study people either socioculturally, linguistically, biologically, or using archaeology. So it's a very holistic discipline, it's a holistic department because we use these multiple angles to answer and ask our research questions. And archaeology, as a part of anthropology, is the study of people through the analysis of material culture, space, and time. So when you think of archaeology, you might think about excavations, digging in the ground. You might have seen myself or some of the PSU students up in the front and faculty excavating at Bonbon Church in Camaligan. We've been at Kipayo. That's all very traditional archaeology. So in archaeology, we're looking to make interpretations about people through the analysis of objects, through the analysis of artifacts, through the analysis of material culture. And so that's often why you'll find us digging or excavating to ask questions about the past. And we use a deductive approach, which means that before we even start collecting data or making inferences, we ask our research questions. And the kinds of research questions that we're interested in focus less on what is this, or what does it look like? Those are all important things to know, but we're more interested in questions like why, how, such as why did this group of people do this? How did they do this? What was the purpose? What was the motivation? What were the patterns of behavior? So we ask those questions first, and then we go in and collect our data to make interpretations to see if we can come to some kind of conclusion or some answer, or if that helps us form more future research questions. And again, going back to that traditional archaeology, if we're asking questions about the past, yes, we can draw on historical records, as you saw from the presentations, the presentation by earlier today and also by yesterday, but we can also use archaeology to collect those artifacts from the past that are maybe buried and make interpretations about them. But can we use those same methods to look at material objects of today? Can we use that same framework of analysis, that archaeological process, to look at objects here in this room, or to look at objects out in the world today? Do we have to dig to be an archaeologist? Earlier today, the presentation, Professor Ocampo, he was saying that he wanted to be an archaeologist, but he didn't want to be outside. He didn't want to be in the sun. I just came from 5 weeks in Sicily, suffering in Sicily, and yeah, it's really hard to do that. And my answer to him for that is, you don't have to be out in the sun to be an archaeologist, because my entire dissertation does not, as an archaeologist, does not rely on excavation. I'm still able to explore my research questions as an archaeologist using these alternative methods, and that's what I'll talk about today. So backtracking again, how did we get started asking these archaeological questions about the Our Lady of Peñafrancia here in Bicol? Where did these questions come from? How are we looking at Spanish colonialism and resistance in relation to the Catholic Church? And those research questions come out of an earlier project, the Ifugao Archaeological Project. So this is an excavation started by Dr. Stephen Acabado at UCLA over 10 years ago now, when he was looking at the Ifugao rice terraces, and he was at first interested to just look at how old are the rice terraces, because as you may know, it's been taught, which Professor Ocampo also brought up in history books, that the rice terraces are 2,000 years old. And so using archaeological methods, excavating, radiocarbon dating, he came to the conclusion or the hypothesis that the rice terraces are actually not 2,000 years old, they're actually closer to 400 years old. And of course, when we first said that to the Ifugao community, there was this kind of consensus of, okay, that kind of counteracts what we've always been told and thought about our place and our culture as this long-lasting thing. If it's much younger, what does that mean? And so the working hypothesis was that the rice terraces didn't need to take 2,000 years old to be produced. They could be produced quite quickly in just a couple generations, and that was done as an act of resistance against Spanish colonialism, when groups from the lowlands migrated up to the Ifugao highlands to escape, to resist Spanish colonialism, and they used political consolidation to very quickly construct rice terraces, construct this community, construct this way of life where they could exist beyond Spanish control in the lowlands. And so that was one way of using archaeology to look at Spanish colonialism, to look at topics of identity, of resistance, of persistence, and how it fits into this narrative of Philippine history. And so the Bicol Archaeological Project wanted to ask those same questions about Spanish colonialism, about resistance. What were people doing during the Spanish period? How were they responding? What were these local responses? Can we ask those same questions in an indigenous community like Ifugao? Can we ask those in a community like Bicol, where it's heavily Catholicized? When I would tell people, oh, I'm doing research in Bicol, I'm going to Naga, the first thing they say, it's one of two things. They're either asking, oh, Bicol is it's a very religious place. It's a very Catholic place. There's a lot of priests there. And I would say, yeah, I know. And then they would say, oh, have you gone to the fiesta for Our Lady of Peñafrancia? And I would say, no, I haven't. And the next thing they say is, you have to experience that. It's very emblematic of being Bicolano. If you're going to Naga, you need to be part of the fiesta for Ina. And at first, the Bicol Archaeological Project, we were excavating at Catholic churches because, again, we want to see what were local responses to Spanish colonialism. We know the Spanish churches have been there since 1500s, 1600s, and so we're excavating there as a starting point. If we know the Spanish are there, we can see what's happening during the Spanish period and hopefully earlier. It wasn't until later that my project on the Our Lady of Peñafrancia devotion developed out of this to continue to ask those questions. If we're looking at the Spanish period and local Bicol responses in the 1500s, 1600s, using excavations, can we also look at the Our Lady of Peñafrancia devotion? Because we know the churches are hundreds of years old, or 100, 200, 300 years old, but we also know that the devotion to Ina is 300 years old. It's also relatively old. So can we look at that as an archaeological artifact that people interact with, and can we ask those same questions? How is that an icon or an image of resistance, even though it's inherently Catholic, it's inherently Spanish in origin? And so my research questions can be summed up into two. How and why have Bicolanos made the devotion to Our Lady of Peñafrancia part of their distinct Bicol landscape? And two, how does this reflect how Bicolanos responded to Spanish colonization? So those were the questions that I wanted to ask. And again, when I would meet with people, tell them, oh, I'm doing this project on Our Lady of Peñafrancia, they would say, oh, are you digging? Are you finding artifacts in the ground at Bonbon Church in Camaligan related to Our Lady of Peñafrancia? And the answer is no. I would say it's very unlikely to excavate and dig and find things directly, very clearly related to this. Our interpretation of archaeological materials is quite nuanced, and so I had to find different ways to conceptualize the image of Our Lady of Peñafrancia as an object in space right now, how would I analyze it, how it relates? Because if we're excavating and we're digging up a piece of pottery, broken pieces or whole pieces, we try and contextualize, how did it get in the ground? Was it thrown away? Was it part of someone's burial goods? What's that process of it getting there? But looking at Our Lady of Peñafrancia, I wanted to look at maybe how does it move through the space? Is it up on stage, in processions, in people's homes? So I think about how that object is used and how people interact with the object, with Ina as an object, and how they conceptualize her in their mind. And because, again, I'm using a deductive approach, I start with my theory of what I anticipate this to mean. So for my research, I focused here in Naga, but I also looked at other areas like Bonbon. I looked in Camaligan. I was in Balaton Lagunoy. I was all over the place interacting with people during fiesta time. And most of my data was collected during 2019 and 2022 fiestas. So before I get into my data and how I looked at that, how I collected it, my interpretation, I want to first talk about why ask these questions? What kind of implications can we have? What can we learn about Bicol as a place, Bicol as a people, even the Philippines in a global sense by looking at this devotion? And so I looked at the theoretical concept of hybridity. So hybridity is a broad realm created within colonial encounters in which identity is dynamic and performative through the mutual exchange of culture between the colonized and the colonizer. And so I was introduced to this theory by one of the members of my doctoral research committee, Charlene Villaseñor Black, who works in Latin America. She works in present-day Mexico, which we know was previously known as New Spain, and that was where a lot of contact between Spain, that was the point of contact between Spain and the Philippines. And so there was a lot of influence coming from New Spain, coming from Mexico over to the Philippines during the Spanish period. And so this concept of hybridity looks at the exchange of culture between the colonized and the colonizer, between the Spanish and the Bicol. And what I think is important to highlight about this concept is that it's a mutual exchange, in that Bicolanos and Filipinos in general were not just passive recipients of Spanish culture. They were not just receiving Catholicism. There was some kind of mutual exchange going on. They were also transforming these traditionally Spanish icons into something specifically Bicol. They were sharing that culture. It was not a one-way street, essentially. And it's important to acknowledge that not all colonial encounters resulted in peoples passively receiving the culture of the colonizer. And what an issue with this is, this type of discourse promotes the erasure of agency. The inhabitants of Bicol likely responded to Spanish missionization in a multitude of ways for different reasons. So there's kind of this emphasis on two ways of how Spanish colonialism happened across the Philippines, that people were either converted, like they were forced to convert to Spanish Catholicism, or they resisted and they moved away. But those are very kind of narrow understandings of Spanish colonialism. And what this research, as well as the Ifugao Archaeological Project, looks at is how can we unpack those reasons? Can we hypothesize, can we explore what else was happening in these interactions? What were the reasons maybe in Bicol, Bicolanos converted so quickly? Because we know in the historical records that Spanish colonization happened and missionization in some areas of Bicol happened quite quickly. What would have been the reasons why beyond they were forced to? What other things can we think of beyond that? Another theoretical concept that I looked at is mimicry, which is which is a part of the concept of hybridity. So mimicry is the construction of slippage or difference between the colonizer and the colonized. So the representation of difference is a complex strategy in which one party appropriates the other to visualize power. Visual mimicry views appropriation of the other from an indigenous perspective. And mimicry, which creates a space for indigenous consumption and appropriation of European practices, it allows indigenous agency, resistance, and creativity to flourish and be recognized. So this concept of mimicry as part of hybridity can look like when a group of people is copying or emulating the colonized group. So for example, if they're emulating Spanish traditions, Spanish practices, Spanish Catholicism, but they are intentionally misrepresenting it, or they're intentionally making it slightly different so that they're not making a carbon copy of what they've been taught or told or expected to do. And that can be a form of resistance as well, kind of saying like, well, we'll do it the way that you're prescribing it, but we like it this way a little bit better. This way is a little bit better for us. So it's that intentional kind of maybe like a couple degrees off to make it more their own, as opposed to directly imitating Spanish culture. And the last concept of my theoretical approach is placemaking. Where is all of this happening? Where are all of these behaviors occurring? If I'm trying to reconstruct how people were acting, what people were doing, what people were thinking, how people were behaving, where is all of this occurring? And that's where the concept of placemaking comes in. So a social identity is enacted within an abstract space, and placemaking occurs when these spaces take on locality and physicality through repeated behaviors and material culture. And so the most obvious place to think of that's been constructed during these times of Spanish colonialism and onward are churches. And so Beagle Catholic churches are important places for maintaining pre-Spanish identity and memory as it is renegotiated into Catholic devotions like Our Lady of Peñafrancia. And this is kind of the most important part of my data and my interpretation, is what places on the landscape of the entire region of Beagle, and especially in Naga and its surrounding peripheries, as we discussed yesterday, what places were important and continue to be important for the devotion to Our Lady of Peñafrancia? Were they always important, or did they recently become important? And does it necessarily matter if they only became important to the devotion now as opposed to 300 plus years ago? So to explore these theoretical bodies of knowledge and to explore my research questions, I use Marian iconography, of course, explicitly the devotion to Our Lady of Peñafrancia. And Marian iconography is a really interesting kind of point to ask these questions, because you can, as everybody knows, there's so many different iterations of Mary, the Mother of God. There's so many different images, iconographies, all over the world, all over Beagle, all over the Philippines. And the question kind of comes into why one over the other, or why is one given specific attention as opposed to another one? And though that can matter on a community level or an individual level, but it just proves an interesting point of iconography to study, because there's so much variability and so much history and storytelling behind why the image looks the way she does, why she has prevalence in one community over another, and how that iconography is shared from city to city, place to place, person to person. And of course, yesterday, the lectures from yesterday discussed Marian iconography in Beagle and how the devotion of Our Lady of Peñafrancia came to be in Beagle. And to kind of not spend too much time rehashing that history, we know that the icon for Our Lady of Peñafrancia was first from Salamanca, Spain, and came over to the Philippines with Miguel Robles de Covarrubias. and eventually made its way to Naga city in 1710. And the image itself has changed quite a bit in terms of aesthetic, what she looks like, the local image that was built or that was constructed, the story of the dog's blood used to paint her face, and the dog in the river that survived. There's all these layers of story into how the image came to Naga and became specifically Bicolano, so that she not only looks different from the original image in Salamanca, Spain, but her backstory is also different. And of course, there's the historical chronology. I know it's kind of small on the screen, but just kind of going through the important points of history related to the image. And while these points are not the focus of my research, they are important building blocks to kind of understanding the devotion, understanding the icons, so that we can ask bigger questions about patterns of behavior and use and identity related to the image. So if I'm not focusing on history, what am I actually doing during my fieldwork? What data am I collecting? And yes, the historical information is super important. So I was collecting information about Naga as a city, about the Archdiocese of Caceres, and looking through all these things. So Naga as a Catholic city, what was the city like in early years? I was also asking and looking for answers like, what was the motivation to convert? What do local historians, someone like Professor Hirona at PSU, what was he saying about the history of the image? But the majority of my data that I was collecting was looking at the present. And so I utilized ethnography to ask questions like, how do Bicolanos today perceive, acknowledge, and practice their devotion to this 300-year-old image? What makes the Peñafrencha devotion different from other Philippine or Catholic devotions? And how dependent are these practices on place? The places of Peñafrencha devotion in Naga are essential to the practice, and even when the devotion is observed outside of Naga, the practices are replicated with place in mind to mimic the Naga fiesta. Sorry. And then the other question was, okay, I think we're good. What rituals, practices, and traditions are critical components of this devotion? These were all of the things in mind when I went out into Naga and into other peripheral communities to learn more about this devotion and to also experience the devotion. And again, I wasn't so focused on the components of the iconography itself. When you're an archaeologist, it's very easy to get caught up in the things, and I wanted to focus on the activities, and so I was not just doing an analysis of things like the manto or other aspects of her imagery. I was looking more at things like, how many images of Ina do you have in your home? How many images of Ina can you see when you walk out on the street in September? Can you see the image on the tarpaulins next to Jollibee? What about Bagsumko, like in this church, in that store, in this private home? Where is the image of Ina going, and how are people, how does the presence of Ina change a room? Even if you look around now, I mean, maybe we can't see much, but whenever you go home or when you leave this presentation today, when you leave campus, look around and see how many images of Ina you can see when you just do a 360 and turn around in a circle. Where can you find the image? And does that change the space? Does it make you feel some type of way? Is that a signal that fiesta is coming? If you walk into a church in Naga, does it mean something different if Ina is in the back of the church or the front of the church or coming down the center of the aisle? Her positionality changes a space. It changes how people behave. And those were the kinds of things that I was interested in looking at. And of course, the biggest aspect to kind of look at this was translation. And so in 2019, I did have the first opportunity to finally be able to tell people, yes, I've been to Fiesta in Naga. And the first aspect of this devotion that I want to talk about is the dawn procession at 3 a.m. from Basilica to Peñafrancia Shrine. And some of the things that I took note of were, in terms of placemaking, is how are these positions for procession chosen? And if you look at the dawn procession, it starts at Basilica, which is where the image lives during the year, or stays during the year. But what's interesting about Basilica is it was only constructed and it only completed construction in the 1980s. So it's relatively new in comparison to like Peñafrancia Shrine, which is the site that is 300 plus years old. But what's interesting about that first leg of the Translación procession is that it links these two important places on the landscape together. And a lot of the data I collected is videos and photography. And so I just recorded what's interesting about this procession. Another thing I was taking note of was how accessible is this procession to people who come to Naga or who are interested watching on live stream. And the dawn procession is, besides being incredibly early in the morning, it's very accessible. It's penitential, it's prayerful, devotees are praying the rosary together, and it's easy to access the image following Mass. It's very easy to go up, to take your baño or whatever, up to the image and experience the devotion up front and up close. There's no competition. Well, post-pandemic is a little bit different, but in 2019 and earlier, there's not much issue with getting close. And of course, that contrasts with the Translación procession that follows later that day in the afternoon. Again, linking two very important sites, the original Peñafrancia Shrine and now the Naga Cathedral, which is at the center of the city, the center of the Archdiocese. And of course, this event is quite different. I won't get into too much of the details. You have to read that free dissertation to kind of get that. But everyone here has likely experienced or observed how this is quite a different experience for devotees trying to get close to the image, trying to get close to Ina, or trying to practice their devotion. So this again was taken in 2019, and this is just outside of Mall. And the last leg of the procession is 9 days later, fluvial procession, when again we're linking cathedral with basilica, and the image is going down the river in the fluvial procession, which is the highlight for many of the entire fiesta. And so what my goal is mapping these processions is to kind of bring a question to, or bring attention to why these specific points on the landscape are significant, and how does this replication or this ritual of carrying Ina and the Divina Rostro through these streets, how is that emblematic of Bicol identity, of Bicol history? That repetition, that revisiting those important sites, it's indicative of how important Naga is to the devotion in general. And it was interesting yesterday, a point that was brought up when we were talking about peripheries and how the devotion the devotion started on the peripheries of Naga, how did it change now to become so Naga-centric, and is that still the case? Is the devotion still inherently Naga-centric? And even though you can argue that it is, there are other rituals and practices like Bagsumko, in which the devotion is intentionally brought out to other places to increase access, to replicate the tradition, and to ensure that the devotion persists. And so this was where I participated in Bagsumko in Bonbon, in Lagonoy, and in Kamaligan. And they were all different types of devotions. And what was an interesting point about this is each time there's a Bagsumko, even though the procession is intentionally following that kind of practice of what happens in Naga for Traslacion. So the image is brought out, there's mass both before and after the procession. The procession still follows what is most local to that community. So for example, in Balaton Lagonoy, it's a maritime procession out on the sea. In Kamaligan, it's a procession on the river because they have access to the river. In Bonbon, there's not really a body of water to kind of replicate fluvial procession, and so instead they had a walking procession, and in 2019, to kind of make the procession a bit different and a bit more special, the parish intentionally used the image of Ina that is used for Traslacion in the streets of Naga. So oftentimes the parish will use whatever image of Ina they already have, but in Bonbon they intentionally use the one that is specifically for Traslacion to kind of make it a bit more special and distinct. This is just Bagsumko on the sea. And in Bonbon, and so in doing this kind of research, the emphasis again is on the landscape. What is the relationship of the image of Ina to the Naga landscape, to the Biko landscape, and to those other peripheral locations? I interviewed priests, I interviewed other locals, I interviewed people who are avoyadores, people who participate in various different aspects of the fiesta, to kind of get a sense of what are everyone's different interactions with this devotion. And one thing that I do want to briefly kind of talk about is my positionality as an outsider. And so I mentioned that I come in here, I'm not from Naga, I'm not born in the Philippines, and as an outsider arriving, I found that people were very, very interested to immediately tell me anything, any personal story about the Peñafrancia devotion. I was told about times that they were on the pagoda and this so-and-so happened, or the devotion someone had with their father asking for help, and so they participated as avoyadores, and then their family members were healed. I heard so many stories that were just willingly shared, and that was one of the more interesting thing about the devotion, is that everyone is so interested to share it. And that's my perspective as an outsider, but what I kind of want to implore to you is you also have a privilege as someone who either lives here in Naga or in Bicol. You're either born here or grew up here, and you have experiences as well that are important to maintaining this devotion, and your perspectives are likely more important than mine as an outsider. And so I just want everyone to kind of consider that during fiesta season and think about your relationship to the devotion, whether you consider it big or small, those stories are important too. And so even though I have this research project and people sharing it with me, the way you experience it and share it is also really important. And that was kind of the next step of moving on with my research, is including more people in interviews. I interviewed plenty of priests because, of course, those are the ones who are making the fiesta happen, making the small parts move, the big parts move. But they're a small percentage of the people who experience the devotion. And so if and when I continue this research, that's the next goal, is to include more people and their experiences and their accessibility to this devotion. Because in looking at something like identity isn't static, identity is dynamic. And so it's important to kind of include different aspects of that and how people interact with Ina. It was easy for me to access the image it was easy for me to access the image as a researcher, but that accessibility is not shared across for the everyday person. And so those perspectives are super important as well in understanding why people participate maybe in dawn procession versus translation versus fluvial, because everyone has a different relationship and experience in trying to get close to the image. Another aspect of looking at the image of Ina as a form of material culture was looking at the image in various churches, like I had mentioned earlier, looking at the image in people's homes. So I would go out in front of the minor seminary and we would survey people and ask, are you here at Cathedral to go up to the image during Fiesta Week? Are you going inside to visit the image? How many images of Ina do you have in your home? Where do you keep the image? So again, I was interested in where the image exists in space and how do people interact with her. Part of what I did for data collection as well was I sat up in Basilica in the area where Ina is and tried to observe how many people came by, how people interacted with the image, because again, this is a very specific behavior. Being close to the image, putting objects like your paño, your handkerchief, up to the image and taking it home. And I would question, why do people do that? Or how often do people do that? What do they feel when they do that? How does the object that they're pressing to the image, how does it change? Again, that focus on material culture, but also how people are interacting with it. I was also interested in tragedy, and that's in tragedy. So looking at events like the collapse of the Colgante Bridge, you would think that if something devastating like that happens during Fiesta, would they change the route? Would anything change? And it didn't. And one interesting point that kind of came up in looking at the history of the devotion is that the devotion persists through tragedy, and that those translation roots were maintained despite what had happened. Or if you think about most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic, how did the devotion persist? What church decrees were made in order to allow the devotion to continue? People were given instructions on how to celebrate the devotion on a smaller scale in their home. In Basilica, the original image of Our Lady of Peñafrancia was placed up in this area that I had recorded in 2019. And that was done to bring the image closer to the community to increase accessibility. So if you look at the devotion over the last 300 plus years, that was one of the main themes that kind of came up for me, is that accessibility changes. It kind of goes up and down. it changes how easy it is for the everyday person to access the image, whether it's, or maybe it's more difficult. Think about the andas, how it was changed to that steel kind of spear. Did that increase accessibility or make it harder for individuals to get closer to Ina during translation? Or think about Facebook live stream, how that increases accessibility. Or pagsungko, how does that increase accessibility and bring the devotion closer to people? Or that the idea of replicating the image over and over and over again. Yes, now, as compared to maybe 100, 200, 300 years ago, there's images of Ina in every parish here in Bicol. But it's not just the actual built image in the parishes, it's the ones that are sold in the streets, the ones in people's homes and people's cars. Or think about the way the image is photographed. Even now, think about if you're going to participate in fiesta, how many more pictures on your phone are you going to have of the image in 1 week, 2 weeks? That repetition of imagery, it's increasing quite a lot. So these are all the kinds of questions that I have as an archaeologist in looking, and to kind of circle back to my original research questions, how and why have Bicolanos made the devotion to Our Lady of Peña Friendship part of the distinct Bicol landscape, and how does this reflect how Bicolanos responded to Spanish colonization? So my initial concluding thoughts. So the procession of the image through Naga and along the Naga River is essential to the devotion. The ritual is replicated in other cities, towns, and countries. Even in times of tragedy, the devotion persists, and devotees find new ways to continue their faith to Ina. Conversion to Catholicism might have been a strategy to maintain autonomy over land and space. So if occupying this or living in this space in Naga and in Bicol was important, that could have been a reason for Bicolanos to convert to Catholicism, because it allowed them to stay where they wanted to. And if they adopted and welcomed this new Catholic faith and this devotion to Ina, they were able to build that devotion directly into the landscape and maintain their relationship to the land. Maintaining cultural importance over landscape markers like the Naga River, even if their significance is recent, is a form of identity making. Through this localization, Bicolanos were essential agents in building and maintaining Bicol as a sacred landscape. The third space in which they negotiated this new and changing identities coincided with their new, It coincided with the new physical places that they were occupying and ritualizing in. And so that idea of localizing the devotion to Ina, making it specifically Bicol by the ways that the procession moves through the city, the ways that the procession is replicated in practices like Pagsunko, or in devotions in other places where Bicol diasporas persist, is a way of maintaining that identity that's persisted since the devotion was initially adopted in the 1700s. And so my next steps for research are building questions that continue to explore Bicolano identity with the iconography and devotion at the heart of the research. For example, what can the devotion tell us about Bicolano individual values, family values, challenges, and goals? Like, for example, one aspect of the devotion that is of interest is if you look at traslacion and how men are permitted to go on the pagoda or for fluvial, or during traslacion, men are the ones who are permitted to go and try and get close to the Andas and close to Ina. One of the things that stood out to me is, why is it only men for this devotion who are permitted the most access, or permitted to participate in kind of this challenge to get access for a mother figure? But what about other women in the community? How might other women participate in this devotion in other ways, or how might they conceptualize this? Because the heart of the devotion is Ina as a mother. And so what I'm interested in is looking at Bicol family values and how that might be related to this devotion. Or how can the devotion navigate future challenges, changes, etc., in an ever-modernizing world? Again, going back to that idea of accessibility, diaspora, one of the questions that kind of stood out to me from the lectures yesterday was how can we maintain the fervor for the devotion throughout the rest of the year? And kind of my initial reaction to that was, or outside of fiesta time, my initial reaction was that it's difficult often for people to participate or to maintain that devotion of time and energy because there are lots of other challenges, financial, emotional challenges that different communities face. And so those are the kinds of things that perhaps challenge a devotion to Ina. How can we kind of mitigate those two together? And again, those are just some initial findings from my doctoral research. Again, I just want to say thank you to the organizing committee. The dissertation is free. You can read it there, as well as some of parts of the interviews that I conducted and a bit more in depth about the data I looked at. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. Dios mabalos madi. So we will go to the open forum this time. If you have questions, you may raise them in our local language and we will try to provide some translation. Okay, so day ka mo magduwa-duwa na maghapot dawa magtaram kita sa tuyang sa diring tataramon. So kung igwa po sabi ka mong hapot, mapahilumlum muna kita. Mahirilingan muna. Maray na hapon po, Father Dan Imperial. Yaon si Manny Sagada, nahiling ko. Si Isay pang pigtutok doon ni Julma. Anyway, so si Dr. Vic Loquias, ang samuyang pamayokang University Research Center. Yaon man. Habang nag-aano kita kang Father Dan, tapos mahapot ako. Taigwa akong hapot. Father Dan, please go to the microphone. Father, gusto mo digdi po. Hello.
Can you share with us some ideas on the meaning dimension that the devotees have, especially devotees from different strata, the simple people, those who are selling wares, those in the hierarchy?
Thank you for your question. That was actually one of my biggest concerns for the data was that it only if I was afraid initially that it would mostly reflect kind of in that hierarchy priests. I was very privileged to work directly with Archbishop Tirona at the time and his staff at the Archbishop's residence, and so most of the people I was interviewing were kind of at that level, and it wasn't until Fiesta started that I started to have access and interacting with more other people who are participating in the devotion. And I think that also highlights, I always talk about, when somebody's doing research, are you the right person? Am I the right person to do this kind of research? Or how can I become the right person to do this kind of research? In the social sciences, objectivity is really difficult to maintain, and your positionality is super important. And so that's why I encourage and implore, if you're interested in this topic, to ask your own research questions and pursue this topic yourself, because it's your culture, it's your heritage, and you should be the #1 people studying it, not someone like me who's an outsider. But I also interviewed and surveyed individuals who were selling these wares during Fiesta, who are out on the streets. Some of them had traveled from as far as Manila to come here to Naga to participate in the economic side of the fiesta. And I know that's kind of a big question too, is the tourism side of fiesta. The emphasis is often on the religious aspect, but the tourism aspect and the financial gain is also super important. So I don't have the slide here. It's in the dissertation though of who I surveyed, and out of maybe 100 of them, I think about 25 were either I had a section, they didn't answer the question of like why they were at fiesta, or they were there to sell. So about maybe, I would say from that 25, 10 to 15 of them were there to sell. And their ages ranged from maybe adults in their 30s to as young as 14. And their experiences of this fiesta are also important. I also interviewed some people who were alongside the river, who live along in those houses along the Naga River, and their involvement in the fiesta is super different again than the priests and their access. And so that's kind of the next steps for research, is including their perspectives, because they're the majority who are participating, or the people in the far communities like in Balaton, Laganoy, that's quite far from Naga. Their experiences are super important as well, and I think there needs to be more emphasis on including them in interviews. But often, and that's why I bring up, either I'm not the right person to do this unless I learn how to speak Bicol very fluently, but that's why I implore others to get involved in projects like this, because there's a hesitancy of people to want to talk about something like this. I mentioned that people are telling their stories, and while that was true, there were a lot who were also very hesitant, and perhaps also because this is a private, experience. Not everyone is so forthcoming with how they experience and practice religion, but that is kind of the next steps for research, to include more diverse voices in how they participate in this fiesta.
Sige na, Tabi. Si Sai Tabi, yes. We have someone from, please identify yourself. There's a microphone there.
Hello. Good afternoon po. I am Andrea from ADNO-JHS YCLC. My question for you po is, of the many Marian icons, why did you choose to study Our Lady of Peña Francia? Thank you po.
Thank you for your question. There's a short answer and there's a long answer. The short answer is, as I discussed earlier in the project, this is an offshoot of the Bicol Archaeological Project, and so I'm part of a group from University of California, Los Angeles, who's looking at and exploring Spanish colonialism in the Bicol region. And part of the reason why this project was established through Dr. Stephen Acabado, who is a professor at UCLA, but he's also Bicolano. He's from Dinambak. And part of his goal as an archaeologist was to establish his project in his hometown in Naga. He also lived in Naga, has family in Naga, because we believe as researchers, as academics, there's an obligation to engage directly in our own heritage, or his heritage specifically, to encourage others to explore their own heritage. And so that's why the Bicol Archaeological Project was established. And so this is just one project of many that has since been started since 2016 here in Bicol and is still ongoing. I think I'm the first PhD out of Dr. Acabado's research that has come out in the Bicol area. There's more ongoing, more incoming in the future. So you'll see more of this type of research coming out over the next couple years. And then the longer answer, sorry, that one was already long, is that why do I study the Our Lady of Peña Francia? And I think for me as an archaeologist, it's important to try different methods, and I've always wanted to engage more directly in topics that I find important, like gender, like religion, and Our Lady of Peñafrancia. It's the biggest Marian devotion, the biggest fiesta in Asia. If that status is still valid, it's the biggest one. And again, that question of that I would get, oh, have you experienced fiesta? You have to experience fiesta. That persistent question kind of really stuck with me. And I think if someone in our group of archaeologists was going to study Marian devotion, was going to dedicate so much time to this project, I think it was going to be me out of our group. And I think my involvement in this as someone who is not, my mom is from the Philippines, but I'm not born here. I think looking at something like Marian devotion and relationship with a mother is really important, and something that we need to use other disciplines outside of history and theology. It's important to look at it from other perspectives like archaeology and anthropology. And one of the things, also the last point, Archbishop Tirona said to me, he said, thank you for bringing the devotion to new places. Like when I present this at UCLA, he'll say, thank you for bringing it to UCLA. Thank you for sharing it with other people who didn't know anything about this. And so I think that's also an important aspect of the research, is also maintaining and helping the devotion kind of flourish.
Okay, and then Father Frank, and then me, okay?
Hello po, good afternoon. I'm very curious about, were you able to, do you have findings about how people behave or treat when there is, how people behave in the presence of the original image of Our Lady of Peñafrancia vis-a-vis when it's just a replica? Because actually, earlier you were showing photos of the Salamanca image and the Naga image. When you look at the Salamanca image, it's actually younger than the image that we have right now, because that Salamanca image is just a repository of the original, which is inside it. So nasira yun, it was ruined in the 1800s. So my question is, did you have findings on how Bicolanos act in the presence of the original image? How reverent are they when they know that it's the original image that's enshrined or is present? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. That's a really good and important question, and one that I think has kind of not a very straightforward answer. So it was something I would directly ask people, which probably wasn't, I mean, it was early in my PhD, so maybe it wasn't the smartest question with the best answers, but I would ask people, does it matter which image you're with or that you're near or that you own or that you take home or see in church? And I would get kind of these answers like, oh, of course the original image is most important, but this one is just as great, like kind of not very straightforward. And I think the answer to that question, it requires more looking into like the spaces that the image will curate, because it's not just the image. You could say very straightforward, oh, if we have the original Bicolano image from 1710, it creates a space, but the object doesn't create the space, the people construct the space around it. So like, for example, before the original image is in Basilica during pandemic, it's in a private chapel and there's security in front, and you can only get in with, if you know somebody or a priest who will let you in. And so that was what I did. I went there, and it's a very small, very, very small chapel. It's completely silent, and you're expected to maintain silence. And so that's a very carefully constructed space for this very important image. But if you look at the image of Ina that's used during Fiesta, during Traslacion, that's also a very important image. And I think that's why the construction of the space around it was super interesting to me to kind of look at, because I knew that which particular image it was that's used for the dawn procession and the easy accessibility. And you would, when that procession is over and everyone's had their turn, everyone just kind of leaves and the image is just there. There's nobody around. And I remember looking at it like nobody's acting any different. But during Translation, it's a completely different story. You can't keep people away, even though it's only a few hours later, but the space constructed around it is super different. And then the next day, I remember I went to the Archbishop's residence and I walked into where that image is kept. And my friend and I looked and we were shocked to see that that was the image back there. I thought that was the image that would be in Cathedral, and it wasn't. But it didn't matter. People were still lining up all around Cathedral to go inside. So I don't want to give an answer because I don't want to say the wrong thing, and I don't think there's a wrong thing to say, but I think it goes into, it's not just the image, it's how people construct the space. The space is almost just as important, and that's why the conversation about landscape is really significant, because it's not just the image, it's the land as well. So thank you for your question.
I think it's important to say this, that the exhibition that we are opening tomorrow is creating that kind of space that you have just said. So I am inviting everyone on behalf of the exhibition committee to don't miss out our exhibition tomorrow at 3 p.m. Okay, so who else is raising their hands? One more, and then Father Francis, please.
Sorry, it was a long walk. Good afternoon, Doc. Can I just ask, were there similarities or patterns of Marian devotion that we have here in Naga or Bicol with other former Spanish colonies like Mexico, Peru? Were there similarities or differences in the patterns of devotion? Thank you.
Thank you. The answer is yes and no. Yes, there's similarities, and I think that's where I looked. A lot of my historical background was looking at, in Mexico, in New Spain, at Our Lady of Guadalupe, because that is the most emblematic Marian image in Mexico, and there's quite a lot of political and cultural significance behind not just the iconography of what she looks like, but also how she's been used as a figure for Mexican national identity as well as Mexican indigenous identity. And so there's certainly parallels in kind of how significant an image like that is in the community in terms of processions, in terms of replicating the image. Of course, what's different about, like, just for example, Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico is the image is modernized quite a bit, which is kind of like an extreme case. Like, you see her on cell phone cases, and like, maybe this is an extreme, like Hello Kitty, Virgin of Guadalupe, like, you know, that's quite an extreme in terms of modernizing it and maybe getting a bit further away from the religious aspect. And those similarities as well as differences, because if we look at that as a form of localizing Marian devotion to that specific country or that specific region, that's the same things we see here. And a lot of those behaviors in terms of processions, they're quite similar. So when I was working on a completely different project in Sicily a month ago, and we arrived in a city and it's nighttime, and we knew that it was a feast day. I think it was for the Ascension, and we arrived and I saw a group of people walking, and we just joined them, and because you know that if it's a procession, people are expected to join. And even though I didn't know the city, I knew if I joined the procession, eventually I'll get to where the image is, or the image is at the front, and eventually I'll get to a church somewhere where everything is happening. So things like that are parallel behaviors, the processions, the candles, the praying the rosary, the different hymns, those are all going to be the same, and those are the interesting things to look at, but the localizing aspects are also interesting too. So like for that local procession that I went to, they had people dressed in like armor, which was local to the city, that were right behind the image, but then right behind is the band, which you would see here for Our Lady of Peñafrancia as well. So yes and no, there are similarities, but then also localized versions of how to make those different. And I think that's why, again, Marian devotion is really interesting to study because of those similarities and differences.
Hello, my name is Father Francis. Mari, I benefited a lot from your thesis. In fact, for several talks, I've been using that concept of hybridity, mimicry, and so on and so forth. But I think I forgot to ask this question. I think that's the word Bicol and Bicolano is used, I think, 100 times in your thesis. Number one question is the concept of that Bicolano very clear to those people whom you interviewed? Who is the Bicolano really for them? And number two is, as an observer coming from the outside, although now that you have eaten a lot of Bicol Express, dinuguan, and a lot of Bicolano foods, who is the Bicolano for you? Parang pang Miss Universe.
Thank you. The first question, who is the Bicolano to everybody else? That would be a great question to ask in my next phase of research, because it is a valid question to ask, because if I'm talking about identity of a group that I'm not a part of, I think self-advocacy is the most important part, is how do people self-identify. And I think that's been maybe the challenging part of this project. Again, I'm early career. I started this research fresh out of my MA. So you can't directly ask people, what does it mean to be Bicolano? Maybe you'll get a good answer, but it comes in more nuanced ways, in experiencing things with them, in having people share their time with you. And I think that's why that repetition of fiesta is super important. Being invited into people's homes, being invited to share in experiences with people, and then kind of broach those topics is all part of kind of the good ethnography. But I think that would be a really important aspect to focus on in the future, is getting more of a gist of how people conceptualize themselves and the devotion. And I think that takes a long time of field work, which I hope to be able to do in the future, and I think that's why people tend to get tired with anthropology and archaeology, because it takes a long time. If you look at something like Fenella Cannell's work, how many years did she spend in Bicol doing that research or learning the language, being with people, living with people? And so I think that's a great question to raise, and one that I kind of hope to explore in the future. The second question, what I perceive as the question of what I perceive as who is the Bicolano? Another great question. I think that question kind of parallels one that I used to get asked quite a lot when I was first talking about this topic and presenting some early research. It was, so what do you think about Bicol? Because that's kind of what it's similar to. What do you think about Bicol, or what does your research tell you about Bicol identity? And my answer to that was always that Bicol is a really special place, and I think it was special from the beginning. Being invited here by my by my professor, my doctoral chair, Dr. Acabado, being invited to work where he's from, in his hometown, because it's more than just coming in here and, archaeology or research traditionally it's extractive. People come in, they might interview, they might excavate, they take what they collect and they leave. And that's not how it should be practiced, and that's not what we strive to be. We come into a place and we want to give back to the community. We want to involve the community in our research questions, in our excavation sites, in what we do. And I think just even being invited by Dr. Acabado to work here means I'm working with his family. His brother is my research assistant. His friends become my friends, or being invited by the Archdiocese to develop research questions. That's really special. I've seen other projects in other provinces fall apart because the church is not wanting to participate or not wanting to ask these kinds of hard questions. And I think Bicol as a place and as a people, not to sound repetitive, but it's special because you don't see that everywhere. You don't see that kind of welcoming and inviting attitude and kind of personality. And I think that's why there's so much history and so much happening here, is because the community likes the history and wants to know more. You come to events like this, and that's a really special quality, and it kind of shows that there's a lot still to do here, and it's a really promising future.
Okay, I have a question, Madi. My question is, are you planning to expand your project in terms of doing research with other Marian icons venerated in Bicol? For instance, in Tiwi there is Salvacion, in Nabua there is Katipanan. Do you see yourself going towards that direction? And how soon can we expect that you move towards that direction? That's my first question. My second question, I was asking Father Francis if we have already find out who sculpted the Virgin, who sculpted the image. Was it a local artisan or a Chinese artisan? And if that is the, if we will entertain that question, that gives us to, that gives me this idea to like how, when we think of the indigenous response, you think of the locals, but do we have a Chinese population in the area, and how did they negotiate in terms of this devotion being carried out by the Catholic Church and by the locals? 2 points.
Thank you. I think the answer to both of those questions is they're related to each other. So to the first one, I am interested to look at other Marian devotions and imagery in the Bicol region, because I think mapping Marian studies and Mariology across the region would be a really interesting way to kind of look at, again, those local communities. Why this image, or how do they interact with the image? What does that say about the community and the history of the community? And looking at, again, those patterns of interaction on the small scale as well as the big scale would shed a lot of light on this region as a whole, and also how it relates to the Philippines as a whole and Catholicism globally. So focusing on that would be a great point for doing that. So hopefully sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, 2 years. And the second question about, so those other people who would occupy or be a part of the local community, like maybe the Chinese, you're right, it is important to consider and highlight them, who's here, who's participating in this devotion, because again, then that kind of goes back to Father Francis, your question of who is the Bicolano. It's not a straightforward answer, because there's a lot of different people who occupy this space, who live here and are part of the history and of the past and the ongoing things that are happening now. I would say to kind of explore that question of who constructed the original image. I think looking at other Marian images who have known, if we already know for sure who constructed them, and kind of looking at more of that comparison would be a place to start, so that we can kind of see what's the differences between that image and the other images with a known constructor, if we know who it is. I think that would be, again, a really important way of looking at not just the history of the image, but the history of the Bicol identity, because it's more than, just the straightforward someone who's born and raised in Bicol, but what does that mean? So, yeah, thank you for that.
Palakpakan po niya to si Dr. Madi Yakal. At this point, I'd like to... Oh, igwa pa si Father.
I don't want to miss this opportunity with you here with your dissertation findings. Two overarching themes that usually surface Number one is promesa. And many of the boyadores, you ask them why, they would say it is a promesa. Second is the idea of conversion experience, especially for those who have been sick, and they say that they have been cured because of the intercession of Ina. Now, my question is, did you encounter those two overarching themes, and what are some of your findings? The second question, it's not really a question, it's more of a information leading to a question. I am Father Danny Imperial. I stayed in the Basilica for almost 20 years until I am fully retired, and but still trying hard. Tired, retired, retarded, and trying hard. Now, did you get the information that the early image had one eye that was a bit, they call it cross-eyed? However, when the image was restored in the early 80s, and then later on, after it was lost, second restoration in the early 2000, it was improved. Now, my question is, to what extent could restoration go, considering the aspect of aesthetics, or perhaps the local sculptor really intended it that way, and it may have totally changed the meaning